In September 1979, a U.S. satellite known as Vela 69111 was orbiting high above the Earth when its optical sensors detected something unusual over the remote Prince Edward Islands. For just a few seconds, it recorded an intense double flash of light over a dark stretch of water. Scientists identified the signature as a nuclear explosion, an intense initial burst followed by a slower fading flash as the fireball expanded and cooled. Yet neither the United States, nor the Soviet Union, nor France had scheduled any operations in the region. No known nuclear power admitted to a test that day. As the event was quietly classified as the Vela incident, intelligence agencies looked beyond the major superpowers. They began gathering seismic data and radiation samples, focusing their investigation on an isolated nation rumored to have nuclear ambitions of its own. Apartheid South Africa stood alone, targeted by UN sanctions and distant from its former Western allies. Despite this isolation, the regime had managed to develop a functional atomic arsenal, while the rest of the world looked the other way. The path to the bomb began in the waste piles of the gold industry. Geologists realized that these tailings were rich in uranium oxide. South Africa sat on massive reserves, second only to those in the Soviet Union. Desperate to secure uranium supplies for their own nuclear programs, Western powers helped South Africa build the Safari 1 research reactor. Provided by the United States under the Atoms for Peace initiative, the facility was officially intended for medical research and energy production. By the 1960s, the political landscape shifted. Surrounding colonies gained independence, and internal resistance from the ANC moved underground. The UN imposed heavy sanctions. South Africa found itself surrounded by hostile neighbors and cut off from international trade. As the regime felt the pressure of this encirclement, they quietly repurposed their civilian nuclear capabilities. Scientific expertise once meant for medicine and energy became the foundation for a weapons program aimed at ensuring the survival of the state. Prime Minister John Vorster viewed every regional revolution and UN resolution as part of a coordinated siege. He adopted a doctrine known as the total strategy, which demanded absolute self-reliance to counter these perceived threats. Because international embargoes prevented the import of standard nuclear centrifuges, local scientists at the secretive Y plant had to innovate. They were tasked with inventing an enrichment process that could be built and maintained using only domestic resources. They developed the Helicon vortex process, which used high-speed aerodynamic separation to enrich uranium. By pushing gas through vortex nozzles, scientists could isolate the isotopes needed for weapons-grade material. This method required massive amounts of electricity. This power draw was masked by the facility's connection to the civilian power grid, allowing the regime to produce weapons-grade uranium under the guise of an energy project. Paranoia drove the regime to create a weapons pipeline that was resilient to global embargoes. By the late 1970s, the partnership between the military and the Atomic Energy Board had produced enough material for their first device. By 1977, the Y plant was producing uranium at 80. Instead of detonating a bomb, they would stockpile it as a political weapon. If the regime faced the threat of collapse, they would reveal the arsenal to the West to force a military intervention. South Africa successfully assembled 6 Hiroshima-style gun-type fission bombs. These weapons, known internally as Hobo and later renamed Kabot, were designed to be airdropped by modified Canberra bombers or fitted to short-range missiles. Without ever confirming a test, South Africa had established a shadow arsenal. They held a terrifying amount of leverage, possessing the means to change the regional balance of power in an instant. By the late 1980s, the justifications for the program were vanishing. The Cold War was ending, Cuban troops withdrew from Angola, and the apartheid state was struggling under internal unrest and a failing economy. As a transition of power became inevitable, the military elite feared the consequences of losing control. Their greatest concern was that the nuclear arsenal would fall into the hands of the very revolutionary leaders they were preparing to negotiate with. In 1989, President F.W. de Klerk issued a secretive order. The weapons program was to be dismantled entirely before any transfer of power could take place. In a final historical irony, the same fear of losing control that led the regime to build the bombs now forced their total destruction. Over 2 years, engineers disassembled all 6 bombs. The highly enriched uranium cores were melted down and returned to secure storage, leaving no physical trace of the weapons. In 1991, South Africa signed the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. By the time Nelson Mandela took office the following year, the country had become the first in the world to voluntarily dismantle its own nuclear program. South Africa remains a unique case in history. It is the only nation to independently build a functional nuclear arsenal only to voluntarily erase it from existence before its political collapse.